Good Wednesday evening, everybody. Hard to believe it's only a few weeks until Christmas. I'm Ricky Matthews, not Scotty Powell, who is absent from our discussion tonight, but I'll take his place and fill in for his normal duties of introducing the show. We've got a good one planned tonight with Dr. Marshall Shepard joining us once again, just like last year. It's kind of our end-of-the-year recap, isn't it, Dr. Shepard?
Yeah, I guess
I'm always on here towards the end of the year.
Must be your holiday go-to guy.
Well, it's just a treat. It's our gift from you to us to have you on here towards the end of the year. And
happy
one more panel. Sorry?
No, I was just saying happy to be here. Happy to be here.
Joining us as usual, Kit is at UNC Charlotte. Kit, how's everything going on down in UNC getting ready for finals?
Yeah, tomorrow's reading day, so today was the very last day of classes, so going over what all we have coming up and how the exam is going to be set up. So for a few of my classes, the tests are going, or the final exam is going to be 2/3 our previous tests. So it'll be hopefully relatively easy, at least for 67% of the questions. Tomorrow's reading day, so everyone will be in the library probably all day, studying, getting ready for exams. And then exams start up with like chemistry and common finals. My first one is on Monday. I've got 2 on Monday, 1 on Tuesday, and then 2 on Wednesday. So,
just remember with advanced dynamics, just write some equations down, and that'll give you like 1 or 2 points if you need it on your final.
I'll be needing that advice. Thank you.
And also joining us as usual, Peter up in New Jersey joins us.
How's everybody doing?
All right.
Good. Weather's been boring up here as usual. Just warm, no snow yet. You're supposed to be near 70 coming up this weekend, so time to break out those shorts and flip-flops, I guess.
Good week to hit the Jersey Shore.
Yeah.
I haven't been able to make that joke and reference in a while, so it seems nice. And joining us, not a uncommon visitor to our show, but someone who seems to be becoming more of a regular on our show is Shay Gibson from Charleston, right?
That's right. Yes, with WeatherFlow.
WeatherFlow. So we welcome him once again to our program, and hopefully we'll make him more of a regular panel member as time goes on. So Dr. Shepard's got to run a little bit, so we're going to go ahead and jump straight into here and start off by first welcoming you and asking you, how's your day been going?
Well, it's been pretty good. It's reading day at the University of Georgia, too, so a lot of people know me from Weather Geeks, but my day job actually is a professor at the University of Georgia and director of the Atmospheric Sciences program over there. So we had a little eventful day. We had our holiday party in my department. We had a guest, Dr. Kim Cobb, Georgia Tech, who's also in Showtime's Years of Living Dangerously, was over today giving a seminar on El Nino. I had basketball practice tonight. I coached my son's 8-year-old basketball team, so if my voice seems a little scratchy, I've been yelling at 7- and 8-year-olds for the last hour and a half, so bear with me and capping the day off with you guys. Or sorta, actually. I've got one more thing even after this.
Well, we appreciate your time. Let's just go ahead and jump straight into 2015, which has been, for you personally, a pretty significant year. Weather Geeks continued into its second year. I remember we taped a lot of shows at AMS this year.
Yeah, we're into our second year, and just a little breaking news here on Carolina Weather Group. We're going to be doing that again on this year at AMS Tuesday. Mark your calendars. That's the breaking news. Tuesday will be the taping day. If anybody or any of your viewers and listeners are at the AMS, we're going to be doing about 5 shows, I think, this year. And I can't say who the guests are yet, but I can tell you this: they're really hot. They're good. So definitely come out. We really want to amp up the game day, weather day atmosphere. We had a really good one last year, and so we'll do that again. Hey, I wanted to say something about the comment about the boring weather, because I was in a little Twitter discussion today talking about the polar vortex, which is certainly something we heard a lot about in the latter part of last winter, in the early 2015. And really interesting, Brian McNulty tweeted something today talking about how we have a strong polar vortex right now, yet you don't really hear a lot in the media about it. And we were just he and I were kind of going back and forth about that, because the science says that we have a strong polar vortex, which is not some storm or some front that's coming down to get us. It's always there. It's the circumpolar vortex. The strong polar vortex is when we generally have the least amount of cold intrusion. So we're seeing this really warm conditions here in the east right now. You heard 70 degrees up in New Jersey. that's kind of indicative of these strong polar vortexes. And it's the weak polar vortex that allows those cold air intrusions into the U.S. So kind of find it ironic that we've got this really strong, quote-unquote, polar vortex right now, and we're really warm. So I think people don't understand that. So I've been trying to, it's been a mission of mine to kind of make sure we clarify what polar vortex is.
And a few of the things you've done this year is you've become a writer for Forbes and have written many articles for them, anything from precipitation pops to kind of myths of weather. Highlight on a few of those and kind of take us through one or two of your favorites that you've written, and we'll discuss them a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. I got I'm a big believer. I mean, like I said, my day job is being a scientist and a professor, but I believe that we need to be out there broadly communicating, just like you guys are doing here with this, with the Carolina Weather Group. So not only do I do Weather Geeks, Forbes really approached me. They're trying to ramp up their science coverage, and they wanted a regular contributor of weather and climate stories. And so I write about 4 or 5 a week or so, or I'm sorry, a month. Little 800-word pieces. Yeah, I just wrote one on the science, the meteorology of Star Wars, but it's not about the fictitious weather. I'm using the weather of the various Star Wars planets to explain some aspects of how our weather works here on this planet. So that's actually one of my favorite ones. The most well-read one, the one that really got the most hits, well over 130,000 hits or so, is one that I wrote about. I guess it was hurricane. What was the hurricane that made landfall at Mexico? Strongest on record. My mind's blanking right now.
Was it Patricia?
Yeah. Patricia, yeah, my mind just went blank. That one got quite a bit of play, and then I wrote a follow-up to it because there was this nonsense out there that meteorologists overhyped it. Now, how can you overhype the strongest dang hurricane on record in the Western Hemisphere? So, so I cover all the topics. I've done some fun ones on the top 10 misused weather terms, things like heavy downpour. That's redundant because downpour itself means a heavy rain event. Or tornado on the ground, because we know by definition a tornado is touching the ground. Although some people say, well, it's good to sort of say that in a public communications capacity. And Ricky, you're on the air, you're in the media. Do you feel that it's more useful to the public to say tornado on the ground, even though scientifically it's redundant?
Personally, yes, just because I feel like our viewers connect to it a little bit better. I know if I was speaking back at our university, I'd probably approach it a little bit differently. There's so many different catchwords, from heading your way to, this will impact you, and different phrases people seem to just lock onto and makes them think when they hear those phrases, and that's one of them to me.
Yeah, and I can certainly say that we got into a little Twitter discussion about another sort of redundant term is ridge of high pressure. But many of the folks out there that, some of which we trust say, well, people, if you just say ridge, they're not meteorologists. They don't really know what that means. So, yeah, some of that really is sort of semantic, and some of it is just kind of annoying to me. But I certainly understand, why some of these terms are used. So, yeah, I had a little fun with that one. That was one of my, check out, go to @SciForbes, follow that, or you can follow me at Dr. Shepard 2013 to follow some of the things that I'm writing there. I'm writing about weather and climate topics all the time. So I've got one brewing, but I've got my next one is one that I just got to get off my chest. But I'm not going to write it until next week. It's more of a climate focused talk about it. You guys don't buzz here on this show, do you? No buzz.
No, I haven't installed that yet in our system, but it's coming special from James Spann.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I've been on there. They buzz me every now and then. We got to kind of get beyond this weather and climate divide. It's all part of the same continuum. But my point is, I've got one coming up, sort of talking about the difference in measuring temperatures from tip thermometers on the ground versus satellites, because that's been one that's kind of bugging me lately.
But I think it's a wonderful platform, because when I think Forbes, I don't think weather personally. And to put it out there in the mainstream media gets more people talking about it. And as you mentioned, even our meteorologists talking about it when we talk about these certain words that are maybe not the best words to use, or maybe should be tweaked a little bit in how they're used, to probability of precipitation, to even Star Wars, which I didn't even know you wrote, but now I've gone to find it on the internet here because I'm interested in it. So. Yep. Yeah. It's something that seems to connect to a lot of different people, just like Weather Geeks does.
Yeah, I think that's right. By the way, I wrote one recently on, there's a new study by some of my colleagues at the University of Georgia that points out that not only does most of the public not understand what we mean by 40% chance of rain, they interviewed 188 meteorologists across the field, TV, government, academia, and got on a host of different interpretations of what percent chance of rain means. So I wrote a little article on that trying to clarify it. I know Scotty's down hanging out with Brad Panovich. Shout out to Scotty and Brad down there in Charlotte eating the good food. But one of the things I mentioned there is that, I talked about how Brad Panovich, who wrote a nice blog on how they used and interpret percent chance of rain in his market. So, that was a very well received blog because I had a lot of people tweeting me. It's like, wow, I really didn't know that's what it meant. And I think that's the case. Why does hello, there was someone behind you there. So one of the things that I mentioned is that I think that's one of the reasons we all as meteorologists know we hear this, oh, you guys get paid to be wrong 50% of the time, it must be nice. I think part of that is because people don't understand what percent chance of rain means. I was tubing with my son, and it started raining, and she said, well, gee, the meteorologist said it was only a 20% chance of rain, and why do we have this? And in my head, I'm thinking, well, it wasn't 0% chance of rain, so this is not a bad forecast. But I tried to use it as an opportunity to kind of explain to her what it really means. We were perhaps in that percent coverage area with a certain confidence level that it was going to rain. So, it's just a matter of interpretation.
Which goes back to an idea of getting us all on the same page. And you served as AMS president for for a year, I should say, not several years.
2013.
And as your role in that, it was to kind of unite the weather community between the broadcast sectors, the academic sectors, and the research sectors. Do we all need to get on the same page and just use the same definition?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things. It's a study by Alan Stewart and colleagues out of University of Georgia. If you want to go out there, it's actually available online, early online release in the AMS Journal Weather and Forecasting if you want to. And I actually point to it in the Forbes article that I wrote as well. I think one of the things that they recommend, and much of the feedback from the 188 meteorologists that they surveyed, they suggested that it's not useful. It's so widely interpreted that it's possibly not useful. I know colleagues like Howard Bernstein in the D.C. market tweeted me, and some others as well, saying they try to use descriptive or qualitative terms as much as possible when they talk about rain chance as opposed to that. And I think what even makes this more complicated is now we're going more to these grid point forecasts, these grid-based forecasts as well. So what does that really mean at each grid point? So yeah, I don't know. It may be the time to sort of put that one out in the pasture, but we've got to do it in a way that makes sense, that doesn't really perturb things. Just like on Weather Geeks, I'm of the opinion I'm not necessarily a big fan of the term tornado watch and warning. Although some very prominent colleagues in the field that I respect usually say it's saved lives. Why are you going to change things now? But I personally find that in talking to people in circles that I interact with, that people confuse the two. People actually get them completely opposite at times. So if it takes that much explanation, boy, why do we need to be using it?
She's going to get mad at me for saying this, but my girlfriend didn't even understand the difference once, and I made sure she knows it now. But
right.
It took a moment. I was like, hey, you need to understand.
Meteorologists, unless everyone starts dating meteorologists, I think it's more common than people think. Now, yes, is it saving lives? Is it a part of the inertia of the meteorology community? Of course it is. But I'm a simple little guy from Canton, Georgia. I believe if I have to explain something more than the words itself, that it may not be the words that need to be used to communicate to the public, to people like your girlfriend or my wife or my mother. It should kind of be obvious to them. That was the problem we had with the snow event here in Atlanta a couple of years ago. The big 1-inch snow that shut us down. People confused when it went from a winter weather watch to an advisory. People thought that was a downgrade because people's interpretation of watch to advisory, it sounds like it's a downgrade. So, we've got all these things that we as meteorologists understand, but we communicate, especially people like you, Rick, you communicate more broadly than just to our community or the Carolina Weather Group. You're talking to people that you can't throw jargon around. You're talking to people that when they hear, I heard it today, when you hear the term PDF, as a scientist, I know that that's a probability density function, but my wife thinks it's an Acrobat file format. So you got to be careful about how we throw jargon around.
One thing about watches and warnings, in every science class that I ever had that talked about weather, I always heard watches conditions are right for thunderstorms or tornadoes, and warning is it's on the ground or it's happening right now. But it really doesn't seem like watches are as common as warnings, or aren't put out there as much. Why is that different there?
I think we're seeing a shift in that somewhat because you've got sort of the radar indicated warnings now, as opposed to many of the times in the past, back in the day, probably before some of you were born. You had to see the tornado essentially before that warning got issued, or someone had to see it or report it. Now you got Doppler indicated based on the mesocyclone signature and the Doppler velocities. Now we're in the era of dual polarization radar, where we can look at things like debris balls using correlation coefficient signals and all this good stuff that I'll be teaching at the University of Georgia in the spring in my radar and mesoscale meteorology class. So I think we're seeing that. I think as we're seeing more social sciences within the realm of meteorology, I think the Weather Service and NOAA and private vendors like Weather Channel and AccuWeather and others, they're thinking about how they're getting messaging out there. That's been a big recurring topic on Weather Geeks all year. I mean, look, we're pretty good, frankly, with weather forecasts. The technology's there. I mean, the El Reno tornado, the South Carolina flood. Let's go there. We're recapping big stories for the year. The South Carolina floods. That didn't sneak up on anybody. We saw that coming as meteorologists. But what was also going on at the time that the South Carolina floods were happening? Everybody was focusing on the hurricane that was out there and spinning around in the Atlantic Ocean that ultimately didn't impact anything. But hurricanes are sexy. They get all the media attention. But I kept warning. I wrote in that Forbes article, many of you were saying, look, the story from this is the flood. It is the flood. The precipitable water values, this cutoff low that's setting up in the south, some of the other sort of atmospheric river type features that were feeding off the hurricane in the South Carolina. We knew that was going to be the story. And so people's perception, we've got to think about how we communicate these things to people, because people have this perception there that the hurricane was the big story because that's what they know is the dangerous event. Rain is rain. It's not scary. Oh, I'll just put an umbrella up. I mean, the concept of a flash flood still, I think, is being dangerous. I just don't think it evokes the same fear and awe as a tornado or a hurricane.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, a lot of people here. I'm in Charleston, South Carolina, and so we had. A lot of people were asking me. They're saying, "Oh, what's going on? Is the hurricane making landfall?" And that was, because the winds picked up. There was two different gradients going on in northeast and then an east-southeast. And once the winds turned on, I think a lot of people thought that we were starting to feel the effects from Joaquin. That simply was not the point. So, yeah, exactly right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's what I wrote. I wrote a couple of different pieces in Forbes about that, talking about the fact that the rain threat was always the big concern. Yeah, there may have been some contribution, because if you look at, I wrote an article on atmospheric rivers. Someone from Charleston actually just tweeted me yesterday about that. In fact, apparently he saw a CBS story yesterday on atmospheric rivers. He said, because of Dr. Shepard's Forbes article, I now know what atmospheric rivers are. So there was some moisture streaming off of the hurricane into South Carolina, but really in its sense, in the classic sense of what the definition of an atmospheric river is that really wasn't technically a river, but it's kind of a pseudo-atmospheric river. But yeah, you're right. I mean, people's mindsets, people kind of grasp onto their perception of what danger is. Hurricane sounds way more scary than 10 inches of rain. I mean, even though 10 inches of rain is a lot of rain, I don't think people kind of have a perception of what that can do. But we saw what it could do, and hopefully everyone in your family and there in Charleston and we're okay. There was even another really interesting thing out of this, in that people were calling it a 1,000-year flood event. People calling it a 1,000-year rain event. I wrote on this because I find this is one that we throw around a lot in the communications, meteorology, and community. We throw around these 1,000-year, 100-year flood events. Most people don't know what that means. They think that means that event that happens every 1,000 years, when it's just the probability of 1 in 1,000 chance that it can happen this year. So we could have 3 1,000-year events this year. It's just a really low probability of it happening. And even the nuance of a flood event versus a rain event was being kind of thrown around incorrectly in this event, because flood events are not just caused by what's falling down out of the sky. Flood events are impacted by impervious surfaces, by controlled releases in reservoirs, and all kinds of other interventions. So a 1,000-year flood event and a 1,000-year rain event are not the same thing.
So which one was it?
This was by most accounts, and if you read my Forbes article, I write about, and I think even some of the NOAA colleagues call this a 1,000-year rain event. But even the nuances in the media, they didn't pick up that nuance. So I saw many media stories talking about a 1,000-year flood event, which it was not.
Which goes back a little bit to the over-sensibilization of weather. Is flood sexier than rainfall is? Is it a more exciting term to use?
I think I think floods, rain. I think it probably is, but I still think it's way down on the scale compared to tornadoes and hurricanes, even lightning and wind. I think derecho gets more love than floods. I think people just really. That's a cool sounding term, although it's been around in meteorology forever. But it's just out there now. I don't know what it is. It's the social media. You get these terms and they become hot terms. That's a flood. I got to get to Chipotle. I'm hungry. I'm going to drive through that. So, we've got all of these things like, this perception of flood. Shout out to Russ Schumacher and his group at Colorado State, and it's a group called SPREAD. If you're not familiar with it, Google it. Russ has got funded by the National Science Foundation, and one of the things Russ Schumacher is trying to do with that group, and one of my former PhD students is involved in that, is trying to elevate the profile of floods as a hazard. I think that group, taking an idea that we had here at the University of Georgia, is trying to develop some type of flood index on the order of the Saffir-Simpson or the Fujita-like scale because reality. I guarantee if you poll your viewers or your listeners, if you break in. And you break into like All My Children or like Scandal or I don't know what's hot right now. I don't know. I don't watch much TV. Amazing Race. You break into that. So man, we're gonna have 2 inches potential localized flooding in parts of blah blah. People are gonna be hot. They're gonna be ticked off at you. But I don't think it will have the same level of anger if you break in and say, man, there's a Cat 4 hurricane making landfall, or there's a EF4 potential tornadic situation developing. There's just a perception issue.
It really is. When it comes down to how people perceive where they live, who they live around, and whether they care about the people they live around. Because a lot of times we'll hear, well, it's not impacting my community, so why do I care?
Yeah, you get that a lot as well. With snowfall, we're coming into the winter. We saw, again, keeping with your theme of tonight's show, the big winter, early part of this year. Boston record snowfall. And for them, that was a big impact. We had a minor snow event here in Georgia in February. Really good forecast. The rain-snow line is always kind of meandering around the Atlanta area, as it probably is in Charlotte and other places up the I-85 corridor. But it was really forecast very well by the Weather Service to within about 20 miles. But if you were you were east of Atlanta, and you were projected to get 2 inches of snowfall, and you didn't because that snow line was 20 miles to the northwest, that was a terrible forecast. I find I get people that want to know how much snow they're going to get in their backyard in the left corner over by the dog water pool. That's how specific people want things today, and they don't understand it. Winter weather forecast, particularly precip-type, is still quite a challenging prospect, particularly in the south. And so, anything within 20 miles or so is actually a pretty good forecast. But people want these pinpoint forecasts. And by the way, I don't know if you guys have an integrated warning team. We had an IWT meeting here in the Atlanta area recently. We're talking about some of these things. The Weather Service here in Georgia is going to start issuing snow probabilities, for example, forecast. And we're talking about the fact that if you say there's 2 to 4 inches of snow, people hear 4 inches. Somehow they didn't hear the 2 to 4; they hear 4. And if you don't get 4, it was a bad forecast. So again, the more we can pound on this from a messaging standpoint, the better.
We get that with a lot of wind forecasting that we do as well. As soon as you say 15 knots, eyebrows get raised, and you hit 20. Yep. The brows get raised even more, and then you're sparking SCA warning type events there. So when you get to 25, 30 knots, of course, that means stay off the water.
So you do hear some sort of threshold by which people pay attention versus tune out with wind?
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, there's quite a few crowds there for different wind speeds. So you have fishermen that hide from the winds, and then you have sailors, which they don't want too much. I'd say 20 knots is going to be a little bit too much for most sailors out there, unless they're smaller boats. And then you have kiteboarders, which they love the higher winds. Windsurfers especially love the higher winds.
Right.
So there's a huge audience for that here, and then rain kind of comes hand in hand. So I stay away from percent probabilities on the rains. I usually use the plume viewer whenever I'm making videos and just say, hey, here's a chance for this much rain on this day. It could be locally higher along the beach or inland. and kind of leave it at that. But the wind probabilities don't work that same way. They use the confidence level, so low, medium, and high, and usually safe there. But yeah, it's tough to forecast for rain in the area, especially along the coastal area where you have sea breezing and other factors that could drop, just like you said, in the back corner of the backyard, more so than in the front yard.
Yeah, people don't realize that rain is a very stochastic, much noisier variable. I could be on the north campus of the University of Georgia and it's raining in the summertime, and in my building down by Sanford Stadium it's completely dry, and that itself creates challenges in terms of how we have to forecast for it. And like on that same day, it's probably 80 degrees everywhere. I mean, roughly speaking. So it's just a different variable from a statistical standpoint. But the public doesn't get that, and they frankly don't care to get that. They just want to know if it's going to rain and what the temperature is going to be tomorrow.
Alrighty. Let's transition a little bit, if you don't mind, and we'll transition to some of the bigger weather events of 2015. You've hit on a few of these already, but I want to take us back all the way into February and comment first on the DC snowstorm, or excuse me, the Boston snowstorms, and the snowfall event that you mentioned in New York City. Put this Boston snowfall into perspective a little bit.
Yeah, I think the thing with the Boston snowfall is it really kind of started out late in terms of the snow, but then they got it really. I've seen some, some of the traces of, they reached this record snow where it was kind of their peak snow over a relatively short period of time. And so, I was getting tweets out there like, man, this is a lot of snow over a short period of time. And, the other, I think, interesting story about that is once they had all that snow on the ground, it lingered for a while. You ended up with kind of a post-winter sort of snow apocalypse event in terms of what do we do with all the snow? Should we dump it in the back bay? So there are all kinds of other sort of tangential issues behind this snow as well. But, I think it's one of these situations where last year we did have a weaker sort of polar vortex, so we had so much of this cold air intrusion. If you look at sort of these climatological plots of sort of cold air and warm air, the eastern U.S. was kind of stuck in a ridge pattern. If you look at some of Judah Cohen, who we had recently on Weather Geeks, he talked, the Eurasian snow cover. He actually uses Siberian snow cover to look at sort of, because it's kind of linked to the Arctic Oscillation, which for those that aren't familiar with that, Arctic Oscillation is an El Nino type sort of teleconnection type pattern. That's something we often talk about, but it's related more to sort of the things happening in the Arctic and the ability of cold air intrusions to make it into the into the continental United States. So we had a fairly weak polar vortex, which basically weakens the fence, if you will, is holding the sheep, as Jason Samani likes to talk about. So you can allow it, when you have that weak vortex, that cold air can break out of the fence and kind of ooze down into the continental United States. Whereas when we have this stronger polar vortex like we do now, the fence is firm, it's rigid, the cold air can't come down until we see these warmer periods. So I think we were really seeing a lot of that last year. With one of those particular storms. It was an interesting storm, and we covered it on Weather Geeks because, there was this notion that New York City was going to get hit with the big one, and they didn't. But Boston did, even parts of Long Island did, so it wasn't that it was completely a bust. And this was a case where, as we talked about, we had Louis Cellini, head of the Weather Service, on, we had Craig Bugate. This is a case where the over-reliance on the very well-performing European model probably bit us in the behind, us meaning the community, because some actually didn't bite that, but the European model was really the one trending towards sort of the solution that would give some of that heavier snow to New York. And I think people were a bit the GFS was kind of hinting otherwise, but I think people were a little bit hesitant to buy the GFS solution, and the GFS is right sometimes. So
I have a question for you on that. Being kind of a fan of teleconnection myself, I always watch the Western Pacific for some of the super typhoon activities going on. And Vongfang would be a good example where we had Ross B. Wave entered down into the United States for November the 1st last year. Correct me if I'm wrong on the name, Vongfang stands out. But do you watch teleconnection from the Western Pacific crossing the North Pacific Jet in the Bering Sea, or do you look a little closer to the continental United States?
Yeah, one thing I mentioned, the reality is I'm not someone that really watches day-to-day weather that as closely as perhaps some of you guys do anyhow. I kind of pay attention to sort of some of the high-impact events, but, my 8-year-old son probably watches a little closer. He's really a weather geek, watches it. But there is literature out there that talks about the fact that when we have these large super typhoons, they can really create their own ripple effect. There's a really good paper. I can't remember the author, but it was a paper done by the Naval Postgraduate School that kind of really first sniffed out this impact of sort of super typhoons on depressing sort of the wave chain and creating a teleconnection downstream. So there's definitely something. Pardon?
Oh, gotcha.
Okay, is that Scotty? Is he driving?
Yes, Scott.
He's not, I think he's on his iPad at the station.
Okay, so yeah, so there's definitely something to that. I mean, I can't say that I look closely at that, but I know I talked to Joe Bastardi, I believe it was, or somebody at Weatherbell about this before, and I think they do. So.
One of our Mets, Steve Wall with WeatherFlow, he said something very similar, a 120-page report on teleconnection. It was great to read, really good read. So there's lots of literature out there.
Yeah, there's so many teleconnections, and for those viewers, teleconnections, these things that are happening in remote places, but because the atmosphere is a fluid, changes in this fluid flow can be felt very much downstream, and that's, I think, the example that's most familiar to people is the El Nino-related teleconnection. But, the basis for Judah Cohen, who's very successful, at least in the last 5 years, his successful U.S. winter forecast, he's basing that on Siberian snow cover. How much snow cover is in Siberia in the fall, and that's really a proxy for the the strength of the Arctic Oscillation, the AO, and the polar vortex. So there are all kinds of interesting teleconnections. PDOs, the Madden-Julian Oscillation, which is a short-term 30 to 60-day tropical-based system, and so all of these things are just like different rocks on the pond, but they're just hitting the pond in different places and at different magnitudes.
I believe Peter had something to add.
Yeah, now getting back to the New York City snowstorm again, the bust thing. I remember even here in New Jersey, we were supposed to have about 12 to 16 inches or whatever. Everybody's posting on Facebook, oh, the Euro, it's going to win this time, And then we ended up with like 2.5 inches the next morning. So, I mean, schools are shutting down. I mean, it was a mess. But, that's the way it is sometimes, and people don't understand that.
Yeah, look, statistically, the European model is a little bit better. If you look at sort of these verification statistics, however, we talked about this just last week with Weather Geeks with Harry Enton from 538, who's their political guy, but he's a weather geek, so he looks at the weather models and whatnot. So statistically, yes, the verification scores, looking at 500 hectopascal verification scores and whatnot, the European model is better, but on any given Sunday, a team is generally statistically better too, but they can lose, right? So I think we have to look at whether you got to utilize all of the data sets out there, all of the models. First of all, let me kind of put on my professor hat for a second. I don't have a lot of hair here, but I'll put on my professor hat. I know you have a lot of weather enthusiasts out there that probably follow you guys and listen. I teach and we teach. I'm a trained all three of my degrees are from Florida State Meteorology Department. My atmospheric sciences program at Georgia. We teach the forecast funnel. We teach our students to look at the broad atmospheric conditions at the global scale first, then funnel down to the synoptic scale, to the mesoscale, and the local scale. We do not go right to the models. And that's something that I find in this current generation is a problem. You got people looking at the models that have no idea. I mean, they're looking at the solutions, but have no idea why the European is better than GFS or what the basis of the models are. So we've got to get beyond that. So that's kind of my little soapbox statement for the night. Let's not be model anchored meteorologists, because frankly those aren't meteorologists. I mean, my 8-year-old can go and pull up the model and look at it and see what it's saying, but can you interpret it and understand how it fits into the broader picture?
Any chance of having Levi Cowan from Tropical Tidbits on your show?
Who knows? We might. I mean, we certainly are aware of him. I've looked at his pages from time to time. Our shows kind of evolve in different ways. I mean, some of them are very topical, contemporary. Some sort of have, like the show that's going to air this Sunday on Weather Geeks. We've got, I don't know how many people realize this, but FedEx has a significant meteorology department. So we've got the head of FedEx's meteorology group on Sunday talking about sort of the particular challenges they deal with from a weather standpoint, with making sure you get your holiday packages, for example, or getting those packages. So yeah, we get to a point in the tropical season, we have a lot of tropical focus shows. Who knows? We may.
No, we here at UNC Charlotte, it might be somewhere else too, but we have a name for people who go straight to the models. They're called model huggers.
Model huggers. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've heard some names that are less flattering than that, but I won't say any. But yeah, it's a big problem. Partly it's because there's even been a debate about whether the model data should be freely available out there as publicly as it is. Well, I don't think you can stop that. But I think the whole point is you've got every Jane or Joe public can pull the model and tweet out or post out their own forecast, some of which are more credible than others, and so that's kind of a challenge that has been discussed in sort of. I used to serve on the NOAA Science Advisory Board, and this didn't come up there, but I mean, it's come up in some of the other circles that I orbit in within the AMS, and of course, there's all this discussion now about whether there should be digital seals the way there are broadcast seals. The NWA already has one. AMS is still studying it. Whether we should put so like you guys, Capital Weather Group, you can go and try to get an NWA seal to stamp on your Twitter presence or whatnot, showing that you guys are credible and you're not just putting out certain things. So.
All right. Okay.
Well, if we want to progress a little bit into the year for weather, we've talked about snow. How about the severe weather season? Like, how did that pan out this year and compared with other years? Was it more active, less active?
Well, I think I saw something just recently, and I don't remember where I saw it. That said there weren't as many lives lost this year from tornadic storms, which that's always a good thing. As I recall, the early part of the season kind of started off relatively quiet too. If you recall, if you go back to the early part of the spring or tornado season, really didn't have that many, frankly. I mean, from a statistical standpoint. So I haven't gone back to look at the exact numbers, but I suspect it was either slightly below normal or relatively normal in the grand scheme of things. Of course, it only takes a couple of big events. And, interesting, one of the most sort of impactful events was a late season outbreak in November. We saw out in Texas and parts of Oklahoma just recently. In fact, I wrote about that in Forbes and talking about, is it really rare to have this sort of outbreak of tornadoes in November? But if you go and look at statistics, particularly in the South, there's actually a secondary peak in tornadic activity in November. So you've got the big spring peak, but then if you go look at the data, I mean, there in November, particularly in the South, there's actually another peak in tornadic activity. So that it really was not that strange to me to see that. Overall, I think we continue to make strides in our ability to predict severe weather. I think I don't think we're, one of my pet peeves is when national media says the tornado came without warning. I think that's just one of those things that's programmed in the sort of national anchors' heads to say. But I mean, these days you just don't really see that. I mean, the new outlooks are in place from the Storm Prediction Center now. They're still testing those out. But we generally have a pretty good idea these days when we're going to have these significant events.
I did a little bit of digging before the show. Two interesting facts I'll throw out here, and then we'll move on to a different topic. Is we did not have any EF5s this year. There was only one EF4 that was in Fairchild, Illinois. And you mentioned the November tornado outbreak. That was the fourth most active tornado day of 2015, with 47 tornadoes that day. 59 on March 6th was the most active day of any
the other thing about this recent November outbreak out there in the Plains tornado out in Texas, Pampa and others, that activity, I talked to Harold Brooks and some other experts about this. What was really unusual about that particular outbreak, not that we had it in November, but it was actually further west than we would typically see one of these November outbreaks. So there are other outbreaks on record in that region, but they were much further east of where this particular outbreak took place. So that was one particularly interesting thing about that particular one.
All right. And after severe weather, of course, we jumped into the tropical season. In 2015 was a very low number of tropical cyclones in the Atlantic Basin, but elsewhere, the Pacific, both east and west, it wasn't as such in terms of activity.
Yeah, it was a pretty typical El Nino-influenced tropical season, in that within the Atlantic Basin, we tend to see somewhat of a suppression of the Atlantic Basin storms because of some of those teleconnections and the sort of jet stream, increased shear, whatnot. On the other hand, in the Eastern Pacific, Central Pacific, and Western Pacific, because of the El Nino-influenced sea surface temperatures, some other atmospheric sort of things that we sort of see in the sort of aggregate data, those seasons tend to be more active, and in fact they were record breaking. When you put together the East Pac, Pacific and Western Pacific typhoons, it was record breaking. And that's something I wrote about. Not only was it active in terms, look, just take the number of storms that we saw in the Eastern and Central Pacific, count them up. If we could take those numbers and put them over in the East Pac, we'd be in the Greek letters, because we'd have probably run out of names almost. So that just gives you an indication. And not only that, during this season, we saw the strongest hurricane on record in the Western Hemisphere in Patricia. So yeah, this season certainly gave us some things to remember. And again, that's one of the things I always get on my soapbox about a little bit. Even with the Atlantic season, I mean, it was, there were storms out there. There's actually a really good Capital Weather Gang article that I saw just today by Bryant McNulty. Check it out if you can, talking about this drought and major hurricanes making landfall here in the eastern part of the country. And he's going into the various reasons why. But he does make the very important point that making landfall does not mean the storm didn't occur. It's kind of like the tree fell in the forest. Did it really fall just because you didn't hear it? So hurricanes are happening out there. It's just not making landfall, and that's because of sort of general setup of the steering patterns and position of the muted high, all kinds of those interesting things. So, it's a really interesting article. But, my overall conclusion is that this was a pretty typical El Nino fuel tropical cyclone season across the globe.
And let's not forget that. Go ahead, Shay.
Oh, I was just one quick tidbit. Always something that comes to mind is that one snapshot of 3 major hurricanes, typhoons, all in a row.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the names of them. I mean, it was so vivid at the time, and you're thinking, wow, that's just incredible.
Yes.
The energy going out, and then the outflow from that to the North Pacific High. Yep. Wow. I mean, there was an extraordinary amount of air sinking away from these storms. It was just incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when we talk about, we start doing, thinking about tropical cyclones from a climatological standpoint or an aggregate standpoint, let's not get Eastern Atlantic Atlantic Basin fever. I see a lot of the people out there in the Twitter sphere that just so locked in on the Atlantic Basin in terms of that as the metric for whether it was an active tropical cyclone season. Well, no, it may have been a quiet Atlantic Basin season, but if you say this was a quiet tropical cyclone season, I'm going to look at you with a serious side eye.
And let's not forget that we had Hurricane Ana, or I can't remember if it was a hurricane or if it was only a tropical storm, but we had the first tropical cyclone in May before the season technically starts up.
Yep, no, absolutely, and Shay's in Charleston. My wife and I took a cruise out of Charleston a couple of years ago. I think it was maybe 3 years ago. And it was in April, I think, maybe May. No, maybe it was May. I can't remember exactly, but I remember it was the B storm that year. We were going right through it in a tropical storm there, whatever the B storm was, because my wife was not thrilled with the fact that we were rocking around quite a bit out there, just off the coast of Charleston.
Right. Yeah, we had 2 in May back to back. One weekend it was Labor Day weekend. Was Beryl. The week before that, I think, was Amy?
What, Labor Day or Memorial Day?
Memorial Day, yes, right, not Labor Day. And they were both tropical storms that brought significant winds and rain here. So
that was Beryl that we were sailing through.
Yeah, and it was preseason, 2 in a row. And we ended up having a pretty active season that year overall in the Atlantic Basin. But the last couple of years with a neutral phase into El Nino, we've had a thicker Saharan air layer and less of a Bermuda high setup. So the Saharan air layer is an area that's something that we're watching more close. I'm here at University of Georgia this semester. I taught my satellite meteorology class, and I spent a pretty decent unit on sort of how we use satellite-based remote sensing to track dust. And one of the reasons that I talked about is the Saharan air layer. And it has multiple impacts on hurricanes. One, it really is kind of a drying agent, if you will, for the hurricane environment. But the other thing that it can do is it can actually, because it has a higher albedo, it can actually block the solar radiation, or what we call insolation of the sun, and can suppress the sea surface temperature warming too.
Dr. Shepard, I want to hit on one more thing. I know we're getting very close to the end. I think Scotty wants to say hi too as well before we
Yes,
jump off here.
yeah.
There he is waving.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about all of these posts we see about being the warmest month on record. I've seen November be the warmest month on record, October. Comment a little bit on that from a climate standpoint.
Yeah, it is. They are, and they will continue to be. But we tend to see look, 2015 is going to be the warmest year on record, and it's not even going to be close. It's lapping the field. And that's typically what we see during El Nino years. I mean, this whole thing about haven't seen any warming since 1998. That was an El Nino year, so it was a relative maxima. So during El Nino years, we see warming. I'm a scientist. I publish in the literature. So I know that the peer-reviewed literature says that there's probably a natural and an anthropogenic contribution to the warming on top of the natural cycle. I'm a scientist. I got 3 degrees in meteorology, so I didn't miss that the climate changes naturally, even though people will still come up to me after talks and say, Dr. Shepard, the climate changes naturally. I was like, dang it, I don't know how I missed that in those classes at FSU. Of course I know the climate changes naturally. But, Barry Bonds could hit home runs naturally too, but, he's using steroids. He could hit longer ones and more of them too. So one of the things that we have to recognize is that during these El Nino years, particularly strong ones, it's not surprising that 2015 is going to be warm. Now, look, I know there's the sort of counter argument out there that says the satellite. This is, by the way, my next Forbes article. The satellite data doesn't show that, Dr. Shepard. Well, I don't know if you know anything about my career, but I spent 12 years at NASA building climate and weather satellites. That's what I do. That's what I did. And one of the satellites that I worked on was the Global Precipitation Measurement Mission, or GPM, which is now in orbit now, giving us really cool measurements of global precipitation. And one of the things we did, I was the deputy project scientist for that mission, and I was also working on the TRIM mission before that. We never used the TRIM satellite to try to validate the rain gauges. We always put out rain gauges to validate the satellite. So this whole notion about the satellite data doesn't show that. I saw an interesting tweet today. I'm not going to be checking the satellite data to see what kind of coat I'm going to wear tomorrow. It's just not going to work, and you've got to use the surface-based data for that.
Alrighty. Scott, did you want to say hi? I know Dr. Shepard's got to run.
Yeah, just thank you I'm sorry I didn't get to be on tonight, but I appreciate you coming on, and hopefully we can make this a yearly occurrence. I think you came on this time last year, so we appreciate it.
Yeah, that's what they said. As long as I'm around, happy to do that. If we can, you got me early enough on the schedule because my schedule's a little bit crazy these days. But let me just close out by saying, I hope some of you will come out to the EMS meeting in New Orleans. It's gonna be a really cool meeting. Continue to support. Hey, we really appreciate the support with Weather Geeks. Let me just share something. We had the producers of Weather Geeks over at Georgia last night visiting with us. And they were saying that when we started Weather Geeks, I think the thinking was, look, we want to have a show out there that's a resource for the weather community, the Weather Geeks. It's probably not going to do decent ratings. It's probably have a few nice shows and it'll kind of fizzle. A year and a half later, we're building audience. We're strong as ever, and that's not as important to me. What's important to me is that we're maintaining the integrity of what we promised to do for all of us who love weather, which is we're taking shows, a lot of the ideas for the shows come from the community, a lot of the guests come from the community. It's not a mouthpiece for the Weather Channel. And I'm not a Weather Channel employee, so we have carte blanche to talk about whatever, whether it's naming winter storms or Torton and whether people like that. We had Span on his opinions of the weather. We may have you guys on, at some point, or some of you on. So it is intended to be a resource for the community, and if it ever becomes anything more than that, I don't want to do it anymore. I want it to be what we started it out to be and nothing more. And it's important for us to maintain the integrity of the show, and if any of you ever feel like we're getting away from that, let us know.
Alrighty, very good. Tell people how they can get in touch with you, Facebook, Twitter, stuff like that.
Yeah, at Dr. Shepard 2013. Dr. Shepard is SHEPHERD. I get it. So at Dr. Shepard 2013, you can follow me there. I do have a public Facebook page that's out there as well. If you just Google my name in Facebook, so I'm out there on that, and you can follow me at like I said, I write a contribution to science Forbes, so at SciForbes as well. So definitely, and then email me at University of Georgia if you have any more specific questions as well. Go Dogs!
Alrighty. Very good. Have a fantastic holiday. Merry Christmas.
Thanks, guys. Thank you for having me on, and great show as usual, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for coming on.
Yep, no problem. See ya.
Alrighty. That was good. Kind of hit on a bunch of different topics, Scotty, about 2015. Started off a little bit about some of his Forbes articles he wrote. So.
Yeah, I'm glad we were able to get him on, and I'm actually here with Brad. I may pan the picture over there to show you guys in just a little bit, kind of what we're doing over here. But I appreciate him coming on tonight. It was great.
Yep. And Kit, you kind of referenced a few things. Did you have thoughts on anything additional?
More just one thing. I'm glad that he hit on it early because we ended up sort of getting close to crunch time. But definitely the whole Joaquin and the upper level low event that impacted South Carolina. I was really glad that we got to talk about that early and didn't have to crunch. But one thing I wish we could have talked a little bit more would have been like how the El Nino set up and like how like into September and August and September is really when El Nino was in the media. It was this year's polar vortex phrase.
And it really was funny we mentioned Brad because I've seen a few of his posts recently from the other day talking a little bit about how with the pattern we're in right now, it really is a favorable El Nino typical kind of setup. We have a nice warm November, December, and then if you've looked at some of the recent models coming into January from both the GFS and the Euro, they kind of show us transitioning a little bit to this cooler pattern. So coming from someone who's working in an area where we get a decent amount of snow in the winter, I'm looking forward to finding out what this winter brings for us. I guess it'll be winter 15 to 16 when we're all said and done with it.
Yeah, I'm seeing just this never-ending warm pattern. I mean, all week long we have just, wow, very mild, very calm weather here in the southeast. And I don't see it breaking anytime soon. Even post-frontal effects are going to be brief, and then we're right back to it. It's almost like the subtropical jet just won't let go. You always have that struggle, and like Dr. Shepard said, there's always a secondary spike in November, but we're also seeing a third spike in December. So that's how long is this going to last? We don't know yet. So I think it might break by the end of December, but make for a short winter time for sure.
You mentioned spikes, and that was one of the neat things I thought about this year too. Looking back on some of the tornado data, it was a pretty calm southeast tornado season for both spring and so far. We still got a couple weeks left in December, and we've had big outbreaks in late December, but it's been pretty calm in the southeast in terms of tornadoes. We haven't had any large supercell outbreaks. The ones that we did have were more of like some small QLCS spin-ups, but I'm not complaining for sure, but it's interesting to see how we've transitioned into this El Nino kind of setup where we typically seem like we get fewer big severe weather outbreaks in the southeast.
Right. Yeah, we did have one EF2 in Charleston in September, and that's kind of a late season tornado spawned from a nighttime water spout. So that was kind of unique. But other than that, we've seen mostly just mesocyclone activity, hail, your typical hook echoing as these storm systems come into the coastline. A few bow echoes off some of the barrier islands, but really it's been fairly calm as far as tornadic activity in the southeast.
And that storm was a pretty interesting one, as it was the Charleston EF2, because I remember watching that one. I think it was like 11, 12 o'clock at night when it came ashore.
I have to go back and look at the NWS storm report on that, on the exact timing. I have a feeling it was a little bit earlier than that, like around 9:30, 10 o'clock. The whole entire vid, I think, lasted about 15 minutes. I can maybe get the track of it if you got a minute. Maybe I can go find it.
I think it was after 11 or 11:30, because I remember all the meteorologists being at home and they had to come back to the station because they had finished their 11 o'clock newscast. But it sounds right to me at least, but it could be different. Alrighty.
One other just large-scale weather event that I remember, since we're just talking about the year in review, I remember there was that high pressure sitting over Texas that posed its own problem with their drought intensifying, but we sort of had a controversially dubbed derecho event come through mid-year. I think it was back in June or July. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember like sitting watching that. Actually, Thomas was gonna. We were looking to do some storm chasing of the derechos, but they all just fizzled out by the time they made it down here. But there was one that went from, I think it was upstate Minnesota all the way down through into the Virginia area. So that was an interesting weather event to just watch pan out over a few days.
Yeah, that was I think that was June, late June of this year was when we had that. And one thing that kind of piqued my interest when you mentioned Texas, we didn't even talk about this at all, was the massive amounts of rain Texas and Oklahoma got. I mean, look at Oklahoma City and how much rainfall they ended up with over, a pretty small period. A couple of weeks they had that. So many flash flood emergencies that were issued.
Yeah, I think they had almost 25 inches in the entire month of May. So I mean, that's probably at least half of what they get the entire year.
Certainly an interesting year, and of course we're not done yet. So we'll see what the next few weeks of weather brings us across the Carolinas and the United States. Well, that's about all I have. Scotty, do you want to add anything else?
No, I'm actually here with our guest next week, Brad Panovich, and Brad and Gary are going to be talking about the Christmas 2010 storms. So Brad's over there working right now, getting some data pulled up. But we're looking forward to that show next week, and before you know it, we may be talking about some snow around here, maybe in the next few weeks to months. So.
He said the S word. Uh-oh.
Yeah. Hashtag SNOEMG.
Alrighty. Any other thoughts from the three of you?
Yeah, Ricky, I got that screenshot. You want me to just grab the screen real quick?
Sure.
Let me see if I can find it here.
Trying to think of one thing you put on there.
Let's see.
One thing you guys should look at is get some.
Not sure if I'm doing that one right.
We're just seeing.
Yeah, I can't seem to get the screen up on this right now. So.
All right. Well, how about this? You can send it to us, and we'll try and put it on our Facebook page, and we can do it that way.
Right.
If that works for you. All right, Kit or Peter, any final thoughts?
No.
Well, to just continue the
Boy, I caught them both off guard, and that was a disaster. Well,
Go ahead, Kit.
I'm sorry, there's a little bit of a delay on my end. I thought I heard a pause, and then it caught back up, and I heard Peter start talking. So, Peter, if you want to, go ahead.
I said I had nothing, so you go ahead.
Okay, then I will. Just a quick outlook, like Scotty said. Next week we'll be having Brad on to look back at the Christmas snow of 2010. But then the week following, I believe we are taking off for Christmas. That's the December 30th show is the next one up, which is Weather Tales with Fox 46 Charlotte Weather Team. We'll be having a number of them on to talk about just what they do and how they work together. And then coming up on January 6th, we'll ring in the new year of 2016 with predicting winter storms. We'll be getting into the winter weather season and hopefully be seeing some new snowstorms. Come through. And we've got warning coordinator meteorologist Christopher Strong from the National Weather Service up in Sterling, Virginia, on for that show.
And that one's going to be really interesting because I haven't seen that topic discussed. I've heard a little bit about it from the folks up in D.C., but they're issuing 4 to 7 day winter weather outlooks, which is something interesting. The WPC is also doing it this year, but they're doing more of an impact-based kind of outlook. So looking forward to that show for sure. Alrighty, folks. Well, we're getting close to 9 o'clock, so I'm going to wrap everything up here. Once again, we appreciate you watching. You can download this in podcast form in a few days once I get that up online. As always, have a fantastic rest of your day and a fantastic week. We'll see you next week, everybody.